I've never quite had an introduction like that. So as a transition, I just constructed a little haiku. Let's just call it KTH. KTH, young Swedish humans, the head, the heart, and the hands, atop the carbon pulse. I think that's kind of what I saw and what I want to talk about. I don't know how many of you watched the 30-minute movie that was sent out. None of you, a few of you, some of you. Okay. So I'm going to speak just briefly about my history and the moment that we are alive and hand over to my colleague, Olivia Lazard. What I really want to do is facilitate a discussion. For the last 9 years, I taught a class at the University of Minnesota called Reality 101. But I started 20 years ago on Wall Street, where I was managing money for rich people. And one of my clients started trading oil futures, and I had to learn about it. And I became obsessed with what I learned. And I learned three major things. Number one, that oil and fossil hydrocarbons are enormously powerful in what they provide for us. 1 barrel of oil does 4.5 years of our physical labor, and the world uses 100 billion barrel of oil equivalents of coal, oil, and natural gas per year, which is the equivalent of 500 billion human workers added to a global economy of 5 billion real humans. We take that for granted because all we have to do is pay for how much it costs to pull out of the ground, when Mother Nature sequestered and formed that over hundreds of millions of years. And we're burning through it 10 million times faster than it was sequestered. And our cultural stories are treating it like it was interest, but we're drawing down the bank account. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that it's going to peak and decline in my lifetime. We were at near the peak of the carbon pulse. And oil is so important because it's liquid at room temperature, it's transportable in pipelines, it facilitates a global interconnected transportation, planes and trains and automobiles, and really diesel and oil act very much like hemoglobin does in the arteries and veins of our bodies in the global transport system. And as that declines, all of our technological plans about the future will have to change, because all of our hopes and our stories about the future are predicated on more energy availability to us. And at some point, we will have less energy available to us. Witness what's happened in Europe since the Ukraine-Russia situation. So we're going to have to use technology in a very different way than we have. And then the third major aha I had 20 years ago, evidenced by the artistic display we just saw, is that we don't include the externalities, the negative impacts of the consumption of our things based on fossil hydrocarbons into the prices of our things. If we included the environmental prices into the environmental costs into our prices, there would probably not be a single industry in the world that would be profitable. So climate change is not the problem. Climate change is a symptom of a much larger systemic issue of a social species, us, finding this bank account of fossil carbon and throwing a 200-year party without a plan. And now it's near morning and we have to have a plan. And that's why I'm encouraged to see so many young people, aware of these things, caring about it, but it's not just climate change, it's our lifestyles, our culture, our aspirations, our values. This is all in play in coming decades. I don't want to take a whole lot of time. I want to get to questions and answers, but I'll just give one piece of advice, especially to the young people. I wrote 3 books with the co-founder of Greenpeace. His name is DJ White. He's a very close friend of mine. And when he was your age, he was a geologist. He studied geology, but he lived in Indiana. And the only thing he knew is he was incredibly passionate about cetaceans, whales and dolphins. But there were no whales or dolphins. whales in Indiana. So he sold his car, he bought a one-way ticket to Hawaii where he knew there were whales, and he volunteered cleaning the whale poop out of the aquarium and then doing tests on whales. And 10 years later, he was started to be the most successful environmentalist of our time. He single-handedly stopped the drift nets in the oceans in the 80s. He did the dolphin-safe tuna. He wrote the script for Star Trek 4. He has a huge list. He stopped a dolphin drive kill in Taiwan. No one knows about him because he didn't care about being famous or rich. He cared about saving dolphins. And there's probably 1 million dolphins alive now because of his efforts that wouldn't have been. He had no idea when he was 23 about these things. He just took a step in the direction of something he was passionate about. So when you hear what's all wrong with the world, don't think you have to solve everything. Just say, what contribution could I have? What am I most passionate about? And just take a step in that direction. And eventually you will find your way to something that has meaning to you and to our collective future. I'll stop there and introduce Olivia.
I'll take a step in the direction then. I'd like to thank the artists who gave us that performance. I was just telling them right now that I came here without having a script for what to say tonight. And that I first wanted to see what they were going to perform, but also just thinking, well, we're at university and this is the place where we ask questions. And I think that this is going to tag along to what you just said, Nate. But I think I'm going to start from the performance itself and just some observations of what came alive for me during the movements and the way that you occupied the space. You use those chains, you use something which is very material, and at the same time you were walking around with water. This is something that is very much alive in how I live through my work, which I can talk about in a minute. It's very fundamental questions about how we build, what we build with, how it builds us back in return, because there is always this relational process with the built environment. And what we build, how it's going to impact where we come from and what we are, which is fundamentally also about nature, which I took as being this representation when you were walking around with water which was dripping. I even wondered, was there a hole in the recipient? Yes, okay. So losing something as you were walking. And there was this moment, I believe you walked into the wall. It was that one moment when you were sort of seized, like you were moving around in many different ways, but at some point you had that sense of direction and you walked right into that wall. Yeah. It was almost as if you had an automatism. And at the end of the performance, if we can call it this way, I don't know if you would use that word, but we were all silent because we weren't quite sure if it was the end. You left us with a lot of questions. And you were living those questions and you were holding them in tension as you were looking at us. So there is the balance between materiality and aliveness. There was a walking into the wall, and then there was a bunch of questions. This is essentially my work, my life, in just a few observations of what you were doing. And I particularly want to pick up from the part of the question. Because we're here in a place which is the result of very elaborate engineering, and this is, I believe, some of the things that are being taught here around engineering. And engineering is essentially a discipline which is geared quite fundamentally towards finding solutions, identifying a problem in a very linear way, and then trying to decompose it in a way that we can find solutions. I don't think that's going to work now with the type of situation that Nate has just described in very succinct words. I also don't think that this is the most meaningful way of going about the multiple crises in which we live today. I know this from a very personal experience because I've come to work essentially on the so-called meta crisis, which is the theme of the week here in Stockholm at the various places where we're invited. And I know this from personal experience because I know that the reason why I'm here today is because of one question, which is a very personal one, and which has been gnawing at me my entire life as a result of family history, as a result of political history, because I'm French and therefore European first, and I come here as a European, and this question is still alive today. What is peace? This question has actually led me to various parts of the world where I wanted to work on political mediation, where I wanted to work on stabilization, where I wanted to be the proud legacy, alive legacy of what peace can be like, right? We know what it's for in Europe because we come from a place of devastation with war. And we have engineered a political project around peace. And it departed from an intention, but it was built just exactly the same way that engineers are taught and tasked and mandated to build material things in the world, to build a built environment within the natural world. What I have learned through my travels is that peace is a journey, it's a constant horizon, it's a constant question that I live through every day in very personal circumstances and very political ones. And interestingly, it led me to another question. When I was, for example, in the Central African Republic, where I was helping a number of different Central African institutions to try and quell violence, to try and build peace, and I noticed that there was a lot of different actors who were pretending to want to build peace, but were essentially trying to acquire a number of different materials. And at the time, when I was there in 2017, we knew that conflict was being fueled by commodities such as gold and diamond. It's still the case. But the backstory to that was essentially that a lot of different forces coming from outside of Africa and various parts of Africa themselves were essentially trying to gain access to other types of commodities, such as rare earths, which the Central African Republic is very rich in. And it was not just the Central African Republic. I went to Gabon, I went to Chad, I went to Niger, I went to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, I went to Zimbabwe, and I could still find again and again and again the same type of story. Ooh, there are lots of Russian actors, lots of American actors, lots of European actors, lots of Chinese actors that are really interested in all of these different deposits. We keep on hearing about how they compete for oil and gas, but what about this? What about all those places where in Europe or in the places where we consider that we have successfully built peace? Well, over there, in Africa or in Latin America or in the Balkans or in Ukraine or in Asia, there are things at work that are funding and fueling a story of progress here. And today, which are being used essentially to build the response to a very fundamental problem, which is incredibly grave, and your performance showed it also with the pain that you could feel, the sort of confusion around the movements that you were trying to bring about. It's very grave, it's very painful. We need to respond to the climate crisis. But there are ways in which we're responding to it in a very sort of linear logic. We have a carbon problem. A carbon problem asks us to decarbonize. Decarbonize asks us to change from a fossil fuel energy source to a mineral energy source, to build solar panels, to build wind turbines, to build grids. And in order to generate the same type of energy system, the same power concentration that a fossil unit holds, we need plenty of different materials to build all those clean technologies. which are being mined in various places in the world. It's not just pointing fingers at mining. Mining has been part of human history. Mining has been the backbone, for that matter, of engineering. And has been the backbone of human progress in a lot of ways. But we've never questioned the logic of progress, because it has brought us, in very differentiated ways, to reap good things. More security in some parts of the world, better health, better education. But now we're coming at a point where essentially we need to look. We need to examine this notion of progress, which is a philosophy, it's a promise. We need to question it because with the way that we're responding to the climate crisis, we do not just risk fueling conflict in parts of the world that are outside of here, although technically not that far away, and we all know it by now with Ukraine, which has ripple effects in Europe and the US, everywhere else. But we're also hitting a wall, a biophysical wall. Because a lot of these materials that we need in order to transition towards an energy system which is clean are actually also found in places that are the foundation of our ecology, the foundation of the ecological resilience of our planet. They are in the deep seas, they are in the Amazon basin, they are in key biodiverse areas, they're in the Congo basin as well. They're in all these places where we know intuitively that it's not just a matter of protection for the climate crisis, it's also an inspiration in terms of beauty, in terms of aliveness, in terms of interrelationship with nature, right? The future of humanity will be either with nature or won't be. And right now, we are following a very logical, very linear response to a carbon problem by having this seizure of like, oof, we're going to follow a direction, and we're not exactly seeing that the direction we're following has a number of different obstacles, has a number of different walls that we're about to hit, and we're about to hit them with the same intensity that you walked into this wall. The force with which we walk into these walls will come back at us. This is already what's happening. This summer is demonstrating it. So I'm going to end by saying we've built multiple civilizations with a lot of different moments of wisdom. And right now, we are at a moment of history where we are following a wisdom which is very standardized and which is very linear. Which is why it was a great idea to have this artistic experience before having Nate or me talk and engage in those questions, because we need to go back to living the questions. We need to understand what to use knowledge for, what we are trying to build. And it holds many layers of metaphors, not just the materiality of the built environment, which helps us to sort of move energy and mountains and all of this and to go into space. I say this because whereas, when I speak in front of people like the ones we're going to speak to tomorrow, I try to project the narrative of like, well, essentially shock and awe. I try to sort of stop them in their track, but that's not what we need to do here in a university where this is the moment of anybody's life where you have the opportunity to ask yourself questions and to learn which question lives in you, which question gnaws at you, and how you're going to let it gnaw at you for the rest of your life in this relationship with life, with nature, with the sources of knowledge that you're going to tap into and that you're going to materialize into the world. This is where we need to have those exchanges, because if I take anything away from the performance that you gave tonight, it's there is wisdom in the movement and in the body and in the livability of the moment. There is no certainty. I did not see you having any moments of certainty except when you went into the wall. There was experiment, there was feeling, and there was experientiality. This is where some of the fundamental wisdom that will carry us into the future lie. Any questions?
Both of us, sure.
Well, thank you for this great opportunity. We need a paradigm shift because our systems are economical and societal systems lead us in the wrong way. And so we need to go to a new goal and to a new system, but we don't know what that system is. And that's why it's so difficult to change. Because we know that the system we have today has brought us out of poverty. We've gone in 50 years' time from 50% poverty to 10% poverty. So if we change system, we have to give up the mechanisms that have brought us out of poverty with all the risk associated. And yet, if we don't do it, we're going to run into a wall. And so I think that is the challenge. How do we move, or how do we even know where to move if we don't know where we're going?
Ask the dancers.
I think you went to each other. You ended up with each other, and you found each other, and that's of course what's basic in all of us. But at the same time, how much suffering can we have, and how much suffering will there come? I don't know. That if we're willing to take it, and if we can take it, and at the end of the day, we're all individuals, and we're all going to have to fight. We will fight for ourselves in the end, even if we're solidary. But people tend to fight for themselves. They can run out ugly also.
In my class, at the end of the semester, I offer advice to the students, and what you just said was one of the central things I say is try to do behavior change, not to save the planet per se, but to make yourself more personally resilient to a potential wall. And so you're flexible, you're not dependent on a lot of money or a lot of energy. But underneath that, the most important advice I would give to young people is find your people, find your friends, because the most emotionally impactful part of your dance was at the end. Not only did you come together, but there was the beginning of a smile and recognition. And social relationships, if you're stressed about something and you have anxiety and you talk to another human being, even if there is absolutely no answer that comes out of the conversation, your cortisol, which is a stress hormone, declines. Your helper T cells, which boost the immune system, go up. Just human interaction with a small group of humans is one of the best medicines for us. And I think what we're headed towards, especially with a school like this, which has a technological focus, there are going to be narratives that we can science our way out of this. And I think Olivia gave a few hints as to why it's not going to be so smooth. We're going to need technology, but we're going to need cultural innovation and other things. So I would recommend, while you're students here, to find like-minded people that you can have lifelong relationships with and talk about these things. That is essential. Because a lot of people, the media, the politicians, and our culture will probably continue to tell this story even while this other story is unfolding underneath. So it's really important to find your tribe and like-minded people.
Can I say something towards what we move? I think I often move towards what I don't know. And sometimes I don't know to where I move to neither. So it's like, it's a scary place to be, but you can practice.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, society hinges on a number of energy resources and on the fact that we put fertilizers on the ground and that we can pump water out of the ground so people can drink and eat. And if you undermine these systems, for one or another reason, people get hungry and thirsty. It's not about choice, it's about basic survival at some point. So it depends, are we going to run into an evolution or a revolution?
I think, yeah. It's not that I just want to give philosophical answers to very pragmatic questions, but there is again a question of logic. You mentioned just now, we need to pump water, we need to sort of, fertilize soils. The reality that you and I know, we've known it our entire life. It's very difficult to imagine something else. And what we know, which is going to be different, comes from history, right? Which inspires stories of like, well, if we are here today, it's a result of, logic and progress, which brings more security, more health, more sort of, stability, and even indeed more peace is the way that we understand it today. In terms of equilibriums between different powers, different communities, like the state and citizens' relationships and that kind of thing. I think that the future is going to look very different. I am not able to tell you how it's going to look, how to picture it. What I can tell you is this: parts of the reasons why I started to work on the energy transition and the larger implications of the energy transition is because I was first working on regeneration. Regeneration in places in the world that needed healing. Some would say stewardship, some would say that stewardship is also more invasive, but let's not get lost in the vocabulary here, but essentially to sort of, revive, reboot, regenerate the aliveness within ecological systems. And to do so in a way that also creates a different type of relationship between humans and their ecosystems. What we know from regeneration today is that all the stuff that we've built in terms of the fertilizer industry, the way in which we hold certain types of economic sectors, which are massive for agriculture, which is also a massive source of greenhouse gas emissions, well, it doesn't work, right? It doesn't work, but at the same time, we're kept in a narrative where this not working is also not going to work, because then we go back into famine, because then we go back into, sort of decay and sort of malnutrition and that kind of thing. But once you start sort of stepping outside of this binary reality and you start considering, okay, so where in the world do we need to do regenerative agriculture? Where do we need to sequence in order to move out of a fertilizing economy? And how do we go there by phasing out or phasing down in certain places and by sort of, growing maybe intensive agricultures in some places if it's appropriate and maybe decreasing it in others? And therefore try to work with the complexity and dynamism of ecological systems, then we start having a vastly different conversation. The problem is essentially that this implies obviously questioning some key economic interests, which are, there's a similar pattern between fertilizer, phosphorus, and, the larger fossil fuel industry or any type of, economic sector that generates essentially a lot of economies of scale at the expense of ecologies of scale. We need to start questioning, okay, so how do we transition power? And that's already on the way, whether or not we like it, right? Yeah. The question is indeed, and I think the essence of your question is, what is the direction of change? Well, to my mind, again, it comes back from asking the right questions, right? Or trying to sort of see the interdependency between different questions. And then as a collective to say, well, what are the ways, what are the strategies, what are the sequences, and then the possibilities? Knowing that there are indeed, some possibilities that we can't know about just yet, because some possibilities are also held into narratives of despair, of fear, or things like this. And it's not to say that they don't exist, but it's also to say that in any case, change is going to be complex and risky. And what we need to do right now is to re-navigate essentially this notion of risk.
Other questions, comments, assertions? Yes.
Since the beginning, we're talking about extractive economy, a lot of work power as well, but was not mentioned who is benefiting from this, like global north countries mainly, and you were mentioning, I guess, like this, where will we go in the future, but it's also a question of what are we going to lose as privileged country, and at the end, it's been mentioned here, like something which is important since the beginning, because it's capitalism, using all those resources, I believe. So do you, in addition of questioning where we go, do you also suggest to quit capitalism? That's the question.
I can answer that. You might not like my answer. So my academic work is on systems synthesis, on how anthropology, energy, human behavior, neuroscience, debt, climate, biodiversity all fit together. And I think humans self-organized around energy surplus starting 10,000 years ago with the agricultural revolution. And that set in motion something that is stronger than capitalism. Capitalism emerged because we found fossil fuels, but when we finished 290,000 years of hunter-gathering and started to farm and store surplus, that surplus then we could eat 6 months later because we had it stored. That allowed us to hire accountants and warriors and priests and all kinds of other hierarchical structures. So we have massive amount of energy surplus right now because of fossil carbon. And the global objective as individuals, as families, as small businesses, as corporations, as nation states is to maximize financial surplus, which is 99% correlated with energy, which is 85% correlated with fossil energy. So it is an emergent phenomenon of what is happening. And yes, some people bear a much larger responsibility for what's happening, but I actually think it's an emergent property of little decisions that were made along the last 100 years powered by this fossil surplus. And I know a lot of billionaires and politicians, and none of them know what to do, and none of them are pulling the strings. Of course, they have huge advantage and privilege. And my view is they should be using their monetary surplus to help smooth what's coming. But I don't think it's such a thing that we can just give up capitalism and this is solved. But I think capitalism and democracy are emergent from this huge amount of the carbon pulse. I don't know the answer, but that's how I frame the situation. And you're right, there's huge wealth inequality within countries and between countries.
How do you handle something like Germany, right? They have all the advantages, but their energy policy clearly isn't going to work, right? The 100% renewable energy is probably not going to work.
Yeah.
It didn't seem like either one of your research led to 100% renewable energy.
Well, I just wrote a haiku and gave my history. I haven't talked about my research here. It would take like 7 hours.
Right,
no.
if you start talking about
Yeah.
earth elements and shipping everything to China and things like that,
Yeah, so
pretty soon solar panels don't look so attractive.
renewable energy is a misnomer. The sun and the wind are renewable. The machines and technology we build to harness the sun and the wind are rebuildable. We have to rebuild them every 20 or 25 years, and they're as complicated and energy and material intensive as a pickup truck is. A chicken is renewable. A oak tree is renewable. Solar panels are just really complicated technology. They're also intermittent, so we need to be paired with batteries, all that stuff.
But what's next? So
The right answer, I think renewables and technology are the right answer to the wrong question, which is, the right question is, how can we use this really mature technology that is far cheaper and better than what we had 100 years ago, in tandem with declining oil and gas, and hopefully no coal at all because it's so carbon intensive, so towards some mix, but you can't have growth with that.
So why is Germany the global model, not Sweden, right? Sweden's mostly hydroelectric and nuclear power, but no one's clear
Because Sweden is a very unique situation that's not globally scalable.
Because of domestic nuclear power production?
Because you have a very low population density and you have a huge amount of natural resources per capita relative to places like the United States or Germany. But Germany is more prominent politically, and so they've built this model. And now, as Christophe introduced me, I refer to our culture as energy blind, which is we think that our wealth and our productivity and our riches are due to technology and money, when it's really due to energy and materials and ecosystems. And what Ukraine and Russia has done is accelerated this biophysical conversation, because Germany has great technology, but 50% of their energy input just got cut off with the Nord Stream pipeline. So all of a sudden, these things are becoming much more obvious to people. So I think energy security and the diversification and how the portfolio fits together is going to become as or more important than climate. And you're already seeing wind turbines last week being torn down in Germany to reopen coal plant, things like that. So I don't know the answer, but this is why we both said carbon maximizing, making the decisions for carbon isn't the full story. There's lots of other things together. I think the truth is hydrogen and renewables and all this stuff, that's not the story. The truth is we're going to have to use less. And that is politically impossible to say until we have to say it.
And that's hard because it's maybe not fair either, right?
That's
We're
right.
in Sweden, but we have representatives from
Yeah,
Bangladesh,
it's not fair.
other parts of the world. It's not fair. Okay.
And that's how you touch on the political side of it and
Yeah.
sociological history as well. I mean, you mentioned nuclear, for example, in Germany.
Yeah.
I think it's fairly well known, or if it's not, there is a very strong aversion essentially to nuclear power, which comes from a very specific political history as well in Germany.
Yeah.
Which therefore means that the response to a technology is not always technological logic, right?
And even if you brought up Greenpeace, right? They're fervently anti-nuclear unless you're young Greenpeace, and then you might argue with old Greenpeace.
Right.
unless really, really old Greenpeace, which are my friends, and they're kind of pro-nuclear, but I digress.
And I think that, what your question touches on is that at the end of the day, the future of energy is going to be made of a lot of different complex things. First, it's going to depend on different geographies regarding energy mixes, right? One of the reasons also why here you have a lot of, in Sweden, hydropower is also because of the natural resource endowment, which has helped essentially to create that power. Same thing with Norway. With climate change, this is going to have to run into problems as well, right? Because we know that the natural resource endowment regarding the water cycle is also going to change, which is going to question hydropower in some places and overflow it in others, right? So the answer is not going to be full renewable or full nuclear or full hydro in any one places. It's going to be what are the different technological
One of those
mixes.
boring technical problems no one wants to deal with because it's hard to explain.
What's your name?
I mean,
Amin?
Ian?
Ian.
Yeah.
So the reason I'm here,
Yeah.
I get invited to speak all over the place and I rarely travel, but I think Scandinavia has a real special opportunity to maybe act as a pilot for what's coming because of the pro-social ethic within the culture, because of low population density relative to the size of the country. You have smaller political hurdles than California. Because of your natural resource endowments, not just Sweden, but Norway, Finland, etc. It's possible.
I'm really confused about that statement because in my mind, Sweden is an exception, right? They're an island, and they're an oasis. They're high. They're not going to be affected by rising sea level change very much. They're super wealthy. They're far north. I'm from North Dakota, so we're kind of
I'm
neighbors.
from Minnesota.
And I spent all summer choking on wildfire smoke, fixing fence on a cattle ranch.
Me too.
Because I'm a frontline community. We're relatively poor. We don't have a lot of water. Sometimes we get nasty flooding. and we're doing agriculture, which is, I'm outside all the time. Why do you think Sweden is a pilot? I think they're like,
I'll tell you why. Because this conversation that we're
Yeah.
having this week here with thousands of people is not happening in Minnesota or North Dakota or Wisconsin. Because the political, I mean, whatever it is, the conversation at the cutting edge on these issues that we discuss is happening here and a few other places. It's not happening in Wisconsin where I live.
And there is also, indeed, there is much more of a push here around the circular economy and different types of technologies also related to recycling. It's been the case for a long time. However, I do think that there are a number of blind spots around politics here as well, right? I don't know if you've heard of the nature restoration law, for example, which was fought over in the European Parliament a few months ago, which is a pillar of how the European Union wants to move forward with its climate plan.
Yeah.
A lot of opposition came from Sweden because there are obviously some very strong political and economic interests regarding the way in which forestry is done, and therefore nature is conceptualized here. So your question points towards, which is interesting, is that at the end of the day, fundamentally, we're not just talking about how to switch one source of power towards one another. What we're trying to talk about is how to remetabolize, essentially, political and economic relationships which have been fundamentally powered by energy in various forms in the past, and therefore by the economic sectors that they gave rise to. Parts of the conversation around this demand reduction that you just mentioned as well, or the different questions around circularity. By the way, I will just mention that in this room there's Kate Rayworth, who's an icon when it comes to anything related to the future of economics and demand reduction. She's very happily sitting over there, but if you want to intervene at any point, you're very welcome to. But interestingly, this notion of metabolism is embedded essentially in security dynamics around the world, in those institutions that we built around this notion of peace, right? Which are essentially relationships of trade, of economics, of certain political legacies between different countries around the world. So if you start changing on top of it the sort of metabolism of an economy, even at national level, not only do you need to sort of arbitrate, negotiate, and create, design this with a number of communities at domestic level, you also need to think of the implications for how a country is connected to the rest of the world, and therefore how it questions this very key fundamental thing that we built our international system upon, which is integration and economic interdependencies create one version of peace, the version of peace that we've evolved with up until today, which is partly crumbling. And that's why, the complexity goes beyond, indeed, this technological question that you're asking. It's like, what is technology holding as a system? And if we want to transition, if we want to remetabolize the system, what direction is it going to go into? Which is in question of values, lifestyles, and things like this. And how do we take it there? How do we process the metabolic change?
Other questions, comments?
Yeah. I feel that this has, I think I would like two things to say. First one, maybe to have also like an opportunity for the people who are here who have been silent up to now to say something that concerns them. So that it doesn't, because, yeah. And the other one is, I would like to say also that there is this injustice of white extractivism since many decades. And if we want to think of a solution, we have to include the people that have been marginalized and silenced in this injustice. And I think this is something from people I know, indigenous people in Colombia, that they are very interested in having a dialogue on an eye level with other forms of organization of life and society, like has been practiced here in Europe, maybe. And I think that there is a lot of topics that needs to be talked about, and I don't want to silence them either in a space like this. But have the privilege to come together. That's my. And I don't know if someone else would like to feels something right now in this moment, has a thought or a feeling, something you would like to contribute to this place where we are together.
I could add something. I am chairman of Cradle, an NGO working for circular economy. But to your point, very few Colombian movies are shown in Sweden. There is one that's called Kings of the World, an amazing Colombian movie that runs now in Stockholm, at least in one theater. So remember it. When you see Kings of the World, it's kind of easy to remember. It's really powerful when it comes to what happens when you have lawlessness and what happens to the people funded by us. But it's really a fantastic, beautiful drama. So just your point.
I think, sorry, I don't have, sometimes I don't have any words anymore, but I have a lot, but I can't, like, I don't know where to start. But, yeah. If someone else would like to say something, share something of how you feel or think right now.
Yeah, I was reflecting on what you said before concerning all these logical questions and how we actually, as engineers or also as a student, how we are taught to tackle all the problems we're facing. And of course, questions might be also to question our lifestyle today might be a good way to go, but maybe we are also losing time just questioning, and maybe we should be also optimistic, saying, okay, the way we go right now to solve problems and to find solutions is the best way we have right now, and this is just the way to go, because otherwise we just still stand and we are reflecting. But yeah, I think nobody else has an idea how to emerge to a new society which is somehow different or based on other values, because we just cannot find something. I mean, it's a question of 5-10 years right now that we're really reaching these tipping points, and maybe it's just so in German you would say pest or cholera, but something you would have to choose for. Yeah.
We're running out of time. And I didn't need this is where personally I relate to a very personal story, right? Like this is a message that I carry everywhere I speak or in what I write, this notion of we're running out of time. I also know from just my personal psyche that if I convince myself that we're running out of time to the point where I don't know what questions to ask myself anymore, I don't know what direction to take. And the level of complexity, as you were pointing out, is such that we can't afford to not act, but we also can't afford to act without a certain sense of wisdom, without a certain sense of direction. And to be also fair, we have, so to your question, Ian, we're talking about forms of technology today, but there are many conversations happening, particularly in Europe. I don't know so much about the US, at least I'm less conscious of them, about demand reduction, about circularity, about recyclability. So there is progress. Kate and I, just 3 months ago, were at a conference in the European Parliament called Beyond Growth, which was gathered by a number of different politicians and parliamentarians trying to look at these questions and look at them from multiple angles, right? So the very simple fact, as you were saying, that we can ask significant questions rather than follow rational business as usual is already a sign that things are moving and that questions are arriving at a moment of conscience which is going to guide multiple actions, way beyond the truth, obviously. but the questions are going to live inside every single one of us. And the quality of the questions that we'll be asking will also guide the quality of what we will do individually and what we will bring to communities and what we can bring in terms of message out there also for those of us who have various levels of influence and reaches and stuff like this. So what I was trying to say is keep your questions alive. I know what questions keep me alive, but also awake at night and have done so for a really long time. And they have been my guides. They've kept me authentic and investigative.
As a comment, I agree with you to keep the questions alive, but it's totally mad to hear this. There's been decades we're talking about climate change and other way to do society. Indigenous people mentioned before there's been decades that they are exploited and they're also silenced. And we have to keep the questions alive now. And you mentioned billionaires and politics before. Obviously they're not pulling the strings, but they are not keen either to ask to question their own privileges. And anyone here living in this room who is from global north countries, so Europe, US, Canada, Japan, and Australia. We are, because our country, responsible for climate change now. So I that makes me just mad, like to hear, like to keep the questions alive. And you were talking about surplus. Sorry, last thing. You were talking about surplus of energy. And you were talking about progress. What is the point of having surplus of energy to watch cat videos on a super smartphone?
Cat videos?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's why we do need a cultural, we need biophysically informed top-down solutions, and we need bottom-up solutions of people not spending frivolous energy. I'm not sure about Sweden, but in America, the body consumes 2,000 kilocalories a day. Mine maybe 3,000. But the country consumes 220,000 kilocalories a day of energy in our airplanes and shopping centers and universities and hospitals. So we use 100 times more energy than our bodies need. Sweden's probably pretty similar. Spain is 50 times. So people need to start acting and consuming less. Otherwise, I mean, why would the corporations and the governments change unless we change what we want?
That's multi-scale change. It cannot be the responsibility of individuals only. How do you want to change in a system that doesn't change? Like even in France, there was this convention with citizens. Like there was like 150 propositions to change things. 3 were taken, and it has no impact.
I agree. I've written about this for a very long time. My personal view is we will not change en masse as a culture. And if you really, really understand that humans are biological organisms and we have steep discount rates and we care about the present and not the future, and we get hijacked by supernormal stimuli, and we seek status based on what others around us have us, and we flex by consuming things. If you really understand that, something interesting comes out the back end, which is you can, as individuals and as a community, change and simplify first before the rush. And I mean, that's one of the best advices I have, because that is something, I don't think society will voluntarily, so humans over centuries and millennia solve problems by adding complexity. And the complexity requires energy. And as we don't have enough energy, we're going to have to simplify or decomplexify. All of the complex supply chains and everything will simplify. We will not do that as a culture, but we can do it as individuals and as small groups and as communities. And that's what I'm here with a good friend, Nora Bateson, and I are speaking Friday night. And on my podcast recently, she said something that stuck with me. She said, how does a meadow change? We don't have engineers plant trees and organize things. It changes organically with the ecosystems and the plants and the processes and the soil and the fauna and the flora. And I think it's going to be the same thing for the society, which is what my work is about, is changing the initial conditions of these future moments by people maybe acting or speaking or trying different projects, etc. Which is why I love the art, the dance here, because my belief, and I've said this for 20 years, is we need theatrical people, artists, poets, authors, storytellers to carve a path. Like, I want to go in this direction, and then we get the architects and the engineers and the technological people to follow that path. But here's the thing, I've spent 20 years understanding the problem. I don't know the answers. I don't know the solutions. And you bring up really valid points that are thorny. And I think the first step is to understand what we face, because we can't solve anything if we don't understand it. And it's much deeper than just climate change. So all of you are now part of a bigger conversation, and after we leave tonight, maybe these conversations will spiral out at the university or with your friends, etc. I know that's not like a cheerleader speech, but I'm being honest.
I get the part where you're mad. I'll just mention a couple of anecdotes. 2 weeks ago, I was with the French Queens in Le Havre on their some school days. I was there with Pierre Charbonnier, who I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a great philosopher. He teaches at Expo. He works on energy and ecology and things like this. And we had been invited to speak of the challenges of the fourth industrial revolution, which has those two legs, right? The energy part and then the digital part. Part of the digital revolution is cat videos on the internet, no meaning whatsoever, but it helps to consume, right? So it brings essentially the system to a certain type of paroxysm, which is self-destructive. And we're the actors of it, the subjects of it, the products of it. That's how the economy is essentially consuming not just the planet anymore, but us as resources. But what I wanted to say originally was, when Pierre and I spoke at the Green Convention, they had never spoken about extraction. They had also not talked about power, because that's part of their blind spot as a political party. And yet, it's supposed to be one of the counterpoints, counter forces in the French political landscape to, you know, the EPPs of this world, or the Renaissance of this world, or the far right of this world, and things like this. There's been a number of blind spots that have been ideological, that have led essentially to not asking the right questions, not preparing the ground beyond essentially a narrative, which was, we need to decarbonize. Yes, we need to decarbonize, but how? And it raises questions of technology, and it raises questions of political constituencies and things like this. And so when you start asking those questions, you start sort of, you know, poking at the fragilities of the system as it exists today, and therefore the blind spots, and therefore the sort of ideological certainties. Parts of those ideological certainties are also, well, I agree with you, of course, I've seen it with my own eyes when I've worked in different conflict zones around the world. The global north, in majority, vastly benefits from extraction of resources, which have been hundreds of years in the making. The hundreds of years have led to systems here in Europe, or in the US, in Canada, Japan, Australia, that have been associated to certain economic metabolism, in some places with capitalism. In the US, it's unbridled capitalism to some extent. In Europe, as we know it, it's been social capitalism for a long time. It's now decreasing. If you start changing the metabolism, essentially, of the way in which energy fluxes function today and economic fluxes function today, you start poking at the foundations of social systems that were the definition of progress for a long time, which is now being changed. But it raises fundamental questions again about, well, what is the relationship between state and citizens? What is the notion of security? What is the notion of education, health, and things like this? And what is a right? What is an entitlement? How is it built over, you know, like other countries or other communities and things like this? And therefore, what is justice? These questions, we're only really starting to poke at them because of the many crises that are coming our way. And as you were saying, the war in Ukraine has very fundamentally attacked some very strong foundations of how economics have functioned and how they've been related to politics. The future, there's partly, again, somebody in this room who's leading that work with a number of cities and communities around the world to try and bring different lenses on the economics of today.
and how to change it via the power of communities or via the power of certain connectors. And the systems change, the paradigmatic change that was mentioned before is going to change by aggregation, because that's my belief, and by certain types of disruptions that are, in any case, either by shock or by design, most probably by shock for now, are going to lead us to that other stasis, essentially, of, well, what is the economy of tomorrow?
I'll simplify your question for you, or a version of it. In order to continue consuming at this level, or anything close to it, will the global north have to decimate the global south searching for minerals and other resources? Not only the global south people, but the ecosystems. Like that is a legitimate question, and I don't know the answer. I don't think it's possible to do 100% renewable or anything close to it at this scale. The world metabolism right now is 19 terawatts, which means we have 190 billion 100-watt light bulbs turned on 24/7. And that is not sustainable. That's all 8 billion humans, like the light bulb of humans. And you're right, it's hugely unequal. But to keep that powered, we now, on an attempt to decarbonize, we have to dematerialize. And that has an additional burden on the global south.
We have to decouple from greenhouse gas emissions. We're not dematerializing, we're recoupling.
Yeah,
And
that's not what I said, correct.
I can say something. I'm a facilitator being in this space, which may or may not be a hidden power plant.
Yeah.
I can definitely feel the heat. And I can feel the power from the performances. Nowadays, what we hear in the background is actually noise from heat exchangers. I don't know why we need heat now in September, but maybe they're doing some cooling right now. I don't know, actually. And behind me, we have original 3 burners burning coal just to heat and to give power to the KTH campus, because here was the turbine. This is the turbine hall of KTH from 1942. Now we get all the electricity from remotely, some nuclear power plants or whatever. But I'm happy that we can be here and have this kind of performance and discussion. When I came here, I turned on the light, but the answer said, we don't want the lights. So switch them off again. I don't want to turn them on now, because then you'll think you have to leave. So I will have it like this. So I'm glad you came.
And it's a fitting space for what we're talking about.
I want to say something. I'm sorry if it comes off as a bit of a rant and if I get emotional, but you'll understand why. So I am from the global south, right? And something that really rubs me the wrong way is, and I know it is maybe vocabulary that we're used to and we use it unconsciously, but it's we're running out of time. It's happening. The crisis is going to happen. The apocalypse is ongoing. It is happening. And maybe it's not happening here in Stockholm, but it is happening elsewhere. Like, as we are speaking, like right this instant, Storm Daniel is hitting my country. Which is, my country is not somewhere where earthquakes happen, where like extreme weather events happen in general. It's happening. It just hit Libya, like the neighboring country. And for context, that is in North Africa, East North Africa. More than 100,000 people, Libyans, are missing. That is not counting, and I'm sorry for like the graphic image I'm painting, but that's not counting the people who are just like dead in the streets right now. For context, that is almost 2% of the Libyan population. So our narrative would be very, very different if 2% of the Swedish population were missing. Because it wouldn't be, oh, the culture will shift organically, we would have to act right now. So no, like the culture, we can't give people, we don't have the luxury of time to allow the culture to shift organically, we have to do something. And we could see it with the response to like COVID, like when COVID really hit certain places,
action, like people spurring into action automatically, and of course there are like some ideological and political like principles that, or like people who were COVID deniers or that, but these were overwhelmingly the minority, but the majority sprung into action, and we could see like a global response. So why is the global response? Like a lot of people don't even know that the storm is happening right now. A lot of people don't know that. What was it, 2-3 days ago? Catastrophic earthquakes hit Morocco, Tunisia, which again, North Africa now, and maybe 2-3 months ago, even more catastrophic earthquakes hit Syria and Turkey. So Egypt is right now like in the middle of this. We felt all the earthquakes. We've had maybe watered down effects of all the storms, but right now it's hands on hearts. It's not, oh, is the apocalypse going to happen? Are we going to be able to act before it happens? It is happening right now. How bad is it going to be for us is the question. And for context, Libya has 8 million people, and see how bad it is destroying. Egypt, like Cairo and the Nile Delta are one of the most densely populated areas in the entire world. More than 30 million people live in Cairo. And like a lot of it is informal settlement, and a lot of it is poor housing. Imagine what happens if the earthquake that hit Tunisia and Morocco hit Egypt tomorrow. Is it also going to be open? We have to wait for the culture to shift. When we have to act? When do we say, okay, no, we can't wait for the culture to shift? We have to have the people. Because it's always Africa as a whole, which also bothers me. It's not one thing, but anyway, it's always treated as Europe's backyard. Like, oh, we're gonna get solar energy from there. We're gonna get green hydrogen from there. We're gonna like export our emissions to there, get the minerals from there. As long as it's benefiting the growth in Europe, right? But as once something like this happens in Africa, and in Africa, like the point that is closest to Europe, like Morocco is the closest point in Africa to Europe, right? It's suddenly, I don't know, like you guys deal with it, it's work on it. Like, okay, but these are the impacts of the expansion that never ends, and the growth that never ends. And we have to think about like wind growth is something, but it is not sustainable. Like you said, like, there has to be degrowth. You have to at some point say, this is enough, like we have had enough, our bellies are big enough, and then we need to maybe give a chance to other people to grow, or just like chill for a bit, not grow for a bit, so other people can literally live and not have their countries destroyed by earthquakes that have never happened in the past 100,000 years. Anyway, sorry for the rant. This performance was a bit on the nose because my country's getting hit right this second, so it was a bit emotional. But yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for what you were saying, and for like bringing to attention that like the selfishness maybe of the global north. And yeah, sorry for the rant.
You don't need to apologize. There's not one answer or one story. We haven't talked about Ukraine, we haven't talked about insects or dolphins or wild animal populations that have no say in this. It's huge, you're right. I think when people say, when's the crisis coming, what they really mean is, when is the crisis coming from us?
Yeah, but who's the us?
Who's us, right?
Because you're saying why in like animals and insects, but us as humans, right? So the crisis has come to us. Maybe it hasn't come right here at this spot that we're standing in, but it has come to us. And it cannot be an us and them thing. Like, we are all humans, and everything that impacts one person or like one nation is going to impact everyone else, as we've seen with COVID. Like you cannot contain something like this. So it's not, oh, has it come to us? Well, it has come to us. So we need to do something. And we can't say, oh, it's there, it came today, and it's us. It is all us. But yeah.
In short, I think it will run until the economy collapses. That's what's going to happen. In the end, the economy collapses, and then everything stops. And then we need to find out a new economy. And before that happens, things will get price, and they're going to get worse and worse and worse until they get so big that the system can't stand it anymore, and it collapses.
I don't agree. If we know that it's going to collapse, we can move on.
Of course, we can do something, but we go to elections every 4th year, and we vote for all kinds of parties. In Sweden, people vote for 8 different parties with 8 different ideas. and it doesn't bring us a solution.
We can question the different ideas actually, because
Okay.
quite a few
Really
people are very confused now. Somebody over there, maybe you want to say?
Can I just thank you, and I'm sorry if my language.
That's not the intention.
This is the message. That's the moment when I become also quite emotional because the reality of what we're living through collectively, if we relate to each other on a human level rather than a geographical level, is I don't really have any words for it. Catastrophic doesn't really come close to what I feel around it. And I think that this is what you're seeing images from Libya. Is that where you're from?
I'm from Egypt, right next door. So we're next.
And it's just mind-boggling. And finally, I think that indeed people are sort of like starting to see images, even in Greece. I mean, we're now talking about potential permanent lakes in the area where there's been flooding. I just want to, I think that what we're trying to hold here, and it's mostly the message also that I was trying to sort of hold for myself tonight, because otherwise it's easy to sort of slow down into something which is just it's too big. But I was in Chile, I went to visit a number of mines, lithium and copper included in April, and I mentioned to some of the people, including some people working on a delegation, that there was going to be this Beyond Growth conference in the new parliament, and that we were going to discuss a number of different things related to, however you want to call it, degrowth, post-growth, or things like this. And then the person who I was talking to said to me, don't you dare, you Europeans, degrowth, when you're essentially changing the rules of the game that we've been asked to play in order to climb up essentially this sort of economic ladder. And that sort of brought some tension essentially in the conversation. And this is the difficulty also of having this conversation with one single narrative. I relate exactly to your anger. I know that I've related to it so much that there have been some moments when I felt completely depleted and I've needed to sort of find other ways to harness energy and emotions in order to keep on going with the work that I've been doing. Because believe me, after having worked on what is peace for more than a decade and bumping into all of those nested interests that were essentially about extractions and supply chains and things like this, it's complicated enough to talk about changes in Europe, but it was also even more complicated to a certain extent to talk about some of the people who were actively participating in murder, genocide, or for that matter, extraction, who were from the very same country that supposedly I was there to try and help. Which obviously falls into some kind of other type of narrative, right? But we have all of these different emotional, analytical sort of narratives, which are essentially sort of tumbling together, coming together, but in ways that at times create some tensions. And my way, for the moment, of moving through this complexity and the difficulty of it, is to keep those questions alive because they guide me. They are writing me as much as I'm trying to write them. And I am making myself essentially some kind of, I do fundamentally believe that we are at an existential crossroads as a humanity, where we have on the one hand scarcity shocks in the natural world and in ourselves, and at the same time we have expansion and we have this new sort of narrative of transhumanism. How to get rid of physicality via a virtual world. A virtual world which for that matter is not very virtual, it's very material, but we're all buying into it in some way, shape, or another. This is completely schizophrenic. How to tackle the schizophrenia, not entirely sure that any one individual holds the answer. We certainly can poke at the questions together and do it with a certain sense of intelligence by holding also some of these emotions, but not letting them stop us essentially to try and reach
this notion of connected. It's very, it works on a plane which is more sort of leaving the door open to what happens essentially when we work with those questions. And I would love it if you could speak about the various questions that you ask essentially in your donut economic workshop, but it holds a lot of power because it holds space. Having answers or having solutions doesn't really hold space, it holds a narrative. With questions, we can come together. We can hold space for emotions as well as analysis. And we can try to write the history, either petit h or grand H, with a different direction in mind.
You had a question, but I would like to also respond to you just very briefly. I live in the United States, one of the worst actors on the stage of these things. I don't have much power or control, but I do have the #1 ranked podcast in the world in the category of earth sciences. And if you would be willing to come on my show, I would at least give you a voice to talk about this as a young person from the Global South. Open invitation if you'd like. And you had a question, and then
You should actually want to respond.
Exit.
Okay, I can go quickly. So just reinforcing Olivia's, staying with the question. I used to be a corporate strategist for many years, and noticed that the system is killing us, and it's difficult to change even single companies and then make a systemic change. You won't do that. Even if you do magnificent progress, you'll have a new head of the board or a new CEO, and you're back to and very effectively in a car crash that goes slow motion for some of us, fast motion for others, and the economic system of the car has no steering wheel and no brakes. And the 27th in the Climate Action Center, there is a discussion of one of the systemic intervention. We don't do everything, but on how ecocide law, an umbrella law that we put at the highest order, and that would shift incentives for the decision makers involved in the worst crimes against the planet and humanity. That will be on the 27th in the Climate Action Center. I don't want to take space for that now, but there are some system interventions that might lessen the crash, and we're already in it. So we have to, like the dancers, I think, move with uncertainty and somehow finding a way without sticking only with one question, but several questions, for years, I think. Yeah, so that was just to reinforce the point.
Thank you. So, thank you for the discussions. I want to add a bit towards what's being said about things that are already happening now. I came from Indonesia. Some villages, like island villages, fishing villages, have already been left behind by the people because it's practically underwater most of the time of the year. But that's not what I'm trying to say here. So, I think I have problems with global north and global south, since it's just like two ways of differentiating the world. Because I want to point out to the countries that are in the middle. I'm pointing out to China and Indonesia itself, because things like China in the late 90s, 2000s, they are trying to catch up with Europe and the States by doing things like very heavy coal mining, coal power, and Indonesia is following that at the moment. One of the most powerful people in the country, literally last week, just wrote in the newspaper that we have a problem with pollutions in Java these days, and they sort of, it's fine. It's maybe not it's fine, but the whole country is trying to catch up with the rest. No, not the rest of the world. Trying to catch up with the so-called global north in economic development, in the way that maybe they disregard the climate and the using coal and pollutions and everything. And I think, because the way that they frame that article is that they want to catch up, right? And then a lot of the investment that comes to the countries investments that don't really care about, okay, they just want to, okay, I'll invest to open this mine here, I invest to open this battery factory here, I invest to do these things here and there. But maybe if, I don't know, I'm saying this because I feel that you seems to be like more control than I have. I've hit the wall, like I just give up. Maybe when the investments are coming to those countries, have a bit more power in controlling that. Okay, those countries can catch up, they can develop in their economy, maybe have some, I don't know, extra things that can help those countries without the government of the country, I don't know, trying to push everything without care of the environment. I'm not making myself clear, but that's the point. Thank you.
I will respond to that in a really depressing way, because I've studied this for a long time. A barrel of oil is 5 years of my hard work for $80. With all the renewables and how renewables have been scaling in the world, we just hit all-time coal production globally last month. We will burn every barrel of oil that we can as a global society. If the global north doesn't, the global south will, because it is so unbelievably powerful for the neurotransmitters and the experiences that we have. We're going to burn it until we can't afford to, or there's not enough, is my opinion. And that will, as he said, have phase shifts in human economies, which is why, as young people that don't have houses or mortgage payments or baby strollers or bosses or any of that stuff, to start training yourself to have most of the best things in life are free after basic needs are met. And granted, for many humans in the world, basic needs are not met. But to start training yourselves, instead of looking at financial capital, look at human, social, natural, and built capital, because you will be personally then more flexible, more resilient to help others and to play a role in a more uncertain future. But I do think we as a species, as a global superorganism, which was the theme of the movie that Christophe sent out, we're going to access energy as much as we can as a metabolic structure. And the fourth law of thermodynamics is the maximum power principle, which is organisms and ecosystems self-organize to degrade an energy gradient in nature, and human society is functioning like that. The question, getting to Olivia's focus on asking questions, is being aware that humans are functioning as a metabolic superorganism. Does that change our potentially being a metabolic superorganism? That's a question I've struggled with for 20 years. I don't know the answer, but I'm hopeful, and which is why I speak to young people and speak to people around my country, mostly in Canada, because people are starting to pay attention to these issues. Getting back to the meadow, how does the meadow change? I don't know, but this conversation, we're all in different places than we were 2 hours ago. Don't know if that's good or bad, but we are.
Maybe just to add on that, the complications, and it shows essentially that the energy transition is not just energy, it's also power transitions, right? Indonesia is at the heart of the energy transition from a global perspective because of its reserves for nickel, in which China has heavily invested. And it's ironically much like China investing a lot into powering its economy to also power some of the mines and then build up its version of development on the back of various forms of energy, and making itself also an arbiter essentially of the way in which the climate transition is going to play, the energy transition is going to play, and therefore how power is going to remetabolize within international relations. Indonesia was famously also one of the top countries proposing to create some kind of nickel OPEC not so long ago. We don't know if it's going to be created, but it shows essentially some of the power that a country like Indonesia holds, or the potential of it, Because essentially parts of, the question that we only scratched by talking about so-called global north, global south relations is also the financial ties that hold all of these countries together, including through debt. And this is one of the major topics at the moment, where some are trying to sort of, again, target it and tinker it and sort of, poke essentially at this massive beast, which is historical legacies of what you talk about, which is extracting certain forms of energy, betting on the future, and essentially sort of creating a massive debt, which translates into ecological damage over time to the point where we're hitting those biophysical limits, but which also translate into more and more constrained, more and more protracted relationships between countries that have been forced into a debt system that keeps on staggering fundamentally their development. This is also part, fundamentally, of the promise of the energy transition. Will countries at the heart of this energy transition, at the heart of this mining transition, be able to change their power and essentially use it to force a different type of financial system? This is part of the conversation which is happening around de-dollarization at the moment, parts of the escalation of tensions between the US and China, between Europe and Russia, and where, again, what's really interesting, when you take it from the perspective of human history, rather than just chunks of it, we're reaching a very schizophrenic element where what we're endangering is not just war, if you want to minimize it. It's this notion of planetary security. We've never had to deal with it fundamentally as a species before. We don't have the templates in terms of international organizations or in terms of planetary organizations. We don't have the legal system for it. We don't even have essential negotiation frameworks that even mention the word oil, gas, coal, critical minerals, or hydropower, if you want to put it in the mix or anything like this. Because we live in a world that has been created over hundreds of years, which results into nation states and power systems and supply chains and all of these different things, which are completely anachronistic with the size of the challenge or the challenges that we have to deal with today. But things are changing, and this is really important to walk away from this room tonight with this notion. And again, I will draw on Barry said person who's also sitting over there. Things are changing. Things are already metabolically changing. They're not amounting to a tipping point in the direction that we want. But there are pockets of change which are happening all around the world, and they start with conversations like the one that we're having tonight. And they start with those questions, and they start with difference, like, Norbert Basin indeed has sort of this beautiful sentence, which is, they start with the difference that makes a difference. And we shouldn't minimize that. I know that it does not bring us to a sense of we're going to be fine, because let's be honest as well, the planet is, we're essentially sort of, we've built a built environment which is threatening ecological health and integrity and interdependencies, and therefore threatening our relationship to nature, and therefore, by reflection, bringing back some questions about what our nature is. So these conversations are already there, and they will shape the future. They already are.
It's a very good conclusion, because we have been here more than we should have been. And I think we should all keep something to take up with us to continue.
Yeah.
I think starting with, as you said, a difference that will make a difference. It's probably, if the caretakers will keep us.
No, I will soon turn on the lights, but keep on.
Yes, yes. But I think if we can take this, try to find the difference that will make a difference, we'll start working on that. It's an enormous challenge, but there are also many, so that's what we can work together. But before we close, I think there are some presents for our guests. They Thank you very much for coming from so far away. We have some pollen from KTHBs, so from the campus. Very good energy, calories. Yes. And the bees are just around, so you can see them. They're on the campus. I think they're sleeping now, but this is a book we wrote together, the energy platform. If you're interested in the book, you can find it online for free. This is the paper version. And we try to explain to the book. We have it in English and Swedish, so don't do this.
Thank you.
And this book, I think, got a chapter actually about minerals, about oil addiction, which is written.
Minor references.
There is no references because we were told that that's some, so for you as well. And for you, there is also a chapter about minerals and recycling.
Thank you.
Cool. So, and the book was just beautiful.
I don't like to.
Just
Yeah, right. But as an engineer,
of course, yes.